So this is about to be the second session of our Atlas Project capstone event. This one is going to be on social and political themes in the novel as a whole. Ben's going to kick it off with some remarks on Rand's political philosophy, but first he's doing some tech stuff, and let me just say a few thoughts about why we thought we'd have a session on this. We've given politics a bit short shrift. I don't think we have throughout the whole of the project. I think there were a number of sessions in which we discussed it well and appropriately, but particularly in the sessions on Galt's speech, there's just so much to cover in Galt's speech, and we focused on the ethics to the exclusion almost of a lot of the other themes. We said fairly little about politics, fairly little about metaphysics, a little bit more about epistemology, which somebody wanted us to discuss, and maybe we'll get around to that sometime later today. But politics, of course, and Rand and Galt's view of the society they're living in, how it relates to our society, is a major theme. We can see it coming up already in the first session we had today, where we're thinking about how the world of the novel relates to our world. And so we want to spend some time on it, and we want to start with a little bit of just reviewing the political philosophy that Galt presents in the speech. And then we have a number of issues to discuss about connecting it to our world. So Ben, tell me when you're ready to begin on that.
I think I'm ready. So
without further ado, Ben Bayer.
I just want to say that before I get into this, well, first of all, thank you again, Robert. I imagine that it's the Institute paying for it, but I know how these things get organized. But to our topic, I think it's really interesting that we've said so little about politics for 8 months, 6 to 8 months of this. When what a lot of people think of this as is a political novel, and that's the way that it's discussed in popular discourse. It always comes up in connection with Paul Ryan, the late Paul Ryan, and but we've managed to barely talk about it, and I think that says that people are missing a lot.
Well, just to play the devil's advocate, it could say that we're missing a lot, right? We're two philosophers who wrote a lot on metaphysics and the foundation of ethics. It might be that we are over-privileging our interests to the exclusion of the politics that's there.
Well,
now, if I thought that, we would have done it differently.
But that's part of the reason why we want to do this session. Yeah. Because there isn't like a single chapter where that's the theme, and what we typically would do is focus on what do we see as running themes through the chapters. Mm-hmm. And this is a kind of an undercurrent through many of the chapters, of course. So let's take a couple of hours to dwell just on it finally today. So what I did was put together a really brief summary of the political points that come up in Galt's speech, basically in the order that they come up. And we'll just put that on the table and then talk about it. It looks like you want to interject at a few points along the way. But the first, at least ostensibly political issue in Galt's speech comes up first in his discussion of ethics, the virtues, with regard to the virtue of justice, which is, of course, her view of what it means to be rational when you are relating to other people, which means it's a social virtue. I wouldn't yet say it's a political virtue, but it's definitely a virtue for relating to other people. And her idea is what it means to be rational is to judge other people's characters objectively, to identify their vices, to identify their virtues, and to reward and to punish them accordingly.
I think, it might be helpful just to think in terms of distinguishing a few things when we talk about it as a social or political virtue. Some people think that ethics, of course, is all about relating to other people, and that's the whole of it. And that's clearly not Rand's view or Galt's view, right? Ethics is primarily about your relation to reality. You would need it as much, she says, on a desert island as in a society. And some of the virtues, the descriptions of them, doesn't make you reference to other people, like rationality. Then there's virtues, and justice is the main one of these, that involves interpersonal relationships in particular, but not necessarily a relationship to a society. So just you and I could be just together. If we were on a desert island, we wouldn't be a society yet. Then at some point we move from interpersonal dealings to dealing with people together as a whole, not just the people you meet, but the society you're in. And then then to politics specifically. And justice is, I think, just this first step to dealing with others.
And I think that's an important context to add, especially when you are understanding how her view differs from libertarianism and other political systems in the classical liberal tradition, because for many of these views, justice is just coextensive with the protection of individual rights, and anything that doesn't involve using force or violating rights is just. But that's not her view, and she's got a much richer view of justice, which, as you say, applies in interpersonal relationships, which are not necessarily relationships to society, not necessarily relations to a government. I mean, I've often heard it alleged of her view that it's nothing but the rights view, but that's perhaps true of libertarians, certain libertarians, but not her.
And we can see this, I mean, a lot of this novel is about, Philip's injustice to Reardon and Lillian's injustice to Reardon, and Reardon's tolerating the injustice of his family. Now, granted, one thing some of his family members are doing is lobbying for bad laws, but the main way in which they're unjust to him is, they don't appreciate him, they live on his dime and don't acknowledge it, and they put him down. And that's not an issue of violating someone's rights, it's an issue of being, ingrateful bastards, and just being really unjust.
So the next major issue that comes up in Galt's speech is the trader principle, which, as I see it, is one of her crucial applications of the principle of justice in regards to the exchange of values. She thinks what a rational man does when he lives in society is he offers value for value, and not just in matter but in spirit. We've now had some occasion to understand better what that means, both in relation to friendship and love, and the converse, the kind of parasitism and looting of the spirit that you saw James engaging in with regard to Cheryl and Lillian with regard to Reardon. But altogether, the view is that just relationships are ones that are voluntary, that are based on voluntary consent to mutual benefit, that involve dealing with other people as rational beings and interacting with them only on the basis of what you can rationally persuade someone to do, which will set up a contrast with the next big issue, which is force. But it looks like you wanted to...
Yeah, I had two thoughts just on the trader principalist connection. If you're just thinking about an individual trade that you and I are engaged in, or us and one or two other people, I would think of it primarily through the lens of justice. Are you giving the other person what they're deserving, if we're thinking of it as a virtue? But particularly when you think of a life of trade, a life where you support yourself in a division of labor economy by trading with people, and this is how you interact. And so now you're thinking of it at a social level, not just a me and you interpersonal, but a social level where I'm living among other people and we're trading all the time. I think in this connection you see trade as a what the virtue of productiveness looks like in a social context. So productiveness is the idea that you have to create your values. You have to earn your keep in the world. You have to be the one that creates and sustains your life. If you were alone on a desert island, that would amount to, creating literally one by one all the things you need, hunting some food and growing it and building your cabin and so forth. In society, of course, you're not going to, we specialize and we trade. You don't build your own cabin, you hire an architect or you rent someplace, whatever. But you have to be producing the thing that you're, in order to be, the way you get it is by trading with him, and you're trading a value you produced for the value you're getting. So living by trade is living by what you earn, by what you produce in a social context. So that was one point I wanted to make, tying it to productiveness. And the other is just drawing out of what you said, two elements in trade, right? One is that it's win-win, it's to mutual advantage. And the other is that it's voluntary. And you can have something that's voluntary but not to mutual advantage. Reardon's relationship with Philip is voluntary. Reardon's agreeing to do it. Philip doesn't have a gun to his head, but it's not to mutual advantage. And likewise with his mother and with his wife, right? These are not trades. These are not relationships to mutual advantage. He's there, but he's not forced to do it. No one's got a gun to his head. They're mooching off of him, right? And this is what a moocher is. It's someone who tries to guilt you or beg you or show you his sores and his needs and extort out of your acceptance of altruism your giving him values without giving you any value in return. So that's a relationship that's not win-win but still consensual. A trade is consensual it's a consensual win-win relationship, right? It's a relationship that both parties engage in because they believe it will benefit themselves. And so I got been in both these elements, consent and the win-win.
Right. So shortly after she presents this, the trader principle, she goes on to discuss the major social evil, which is initiation of force, and the opposite approach to dealing with people by reason, by how you can rationally persuade them, is to use force against them, to negate their consent, to negate the judgment of their mind. And some of the things that are interesting, I think, in this section of Galt's speech is he connects it back to a lot of. Thanks for fixing that. It looks like somebody left a machine on.
Yeah, there was a dishwasher that was turned off with making some noise.
She connects the issue back to a lot of the fundamental principles in metaphysics that she alluded to earlier in the speech. That using force against somebody it's not just that it's a non-ideal way of dealing with people. It's not just that it betrays some lack of virtue. It's that it cuts to the core of what it means to evade reality and to try to take up arms against reality, because you're evading the identity of other people, that they function by reason, and you're rebelling against reality, both because you're evading that people work by free choice and by volition, but also you're negating the judgments that they've made about reality and saying, I don't have to pay any attention to that. And I think she even gets into the issue of how this evinces the fact that many force wielders are working on a kind of death premise. They're working out of the idea of the morality of death, because they're assuming, and you see this in the exchange between Mr. Thompson and Galt, that I won't be able to let you out of this room. I can keep you in here forever. And Galt pinpoints, this is not an offer of a value. This is not a trade. The fact that you're not going to kill me, because fear of death is not the same as love of life. And so as a result, her view is that it's force is a major social evil. That its only proper use is in retaliation against those who initiate it. And the point about its relationship to values and reality is important, because it helps distinguish between those two. That somebody who uses force in retaliation is not using it to try to gain a value. They're not, as if one could. They're trying simply to protect the values that they've already created from those who would try to destroy them.
I should mention on this issue of force, since I'm always plugging things that I think are good resources, there's a really lovely course on this that used to be, I don't think it's in its current form available from the Ayn Rand bookstore, but you might be able to find it online secondhand or something. Yeah, by Darrell Wright, called Reason and Freedom, that talks about the relationship of force and the mind. And a revised and improved version of that material is going to be in the next Ayn Rand Society book, and we've just indeed made some progress on it. With progress on when that'll be out, I can't share the details, but it's moving ahead. But if you people who are members of the society or contributors of the society should be getting a copy of the written version of that very soon now. So if you sign up for the Ayn Rand Society at aynrandsociety.org and pay, I forget what it is to be a contributor, I think $30, you'll get this essay, and I call it an essay, but it's like 80, 90 pages. So it's a little monograph, and also some other pieces on political philosophy you'll get emailed to you that will, in due course, come out in a book by the Ayn Rand Society with a lot of essays on political philosophy.
It's a really excellent essay, and it deepens the connections between Rand's views on force and her especially her broader epistemological view, if I recall, that somebody it helps explain why it is that force is anti-mind, why somebody who's acting under force literally cannot engage in cognition, that maybe they can appear to do it, but it's just a kind of engaging in arbitrary, absent evidence. And,
yeah, it spells out a lot of these ideas in Galt's speech, and it was actually, I think you and I met in that class, Ben, back in 1999, or at least at that conference. I was sitting next to you and remember chatting to you about it. So Ben and I go back a ways, and it was a really good class. I remember it being pivotal in my starting to think about some of these issues. And I'm very happy that the Ayn Rand Society is going to be able to bring it out in written form. You can get a preview copy at a discount rate, or anyway, a good rate, if you sign up at AynRandSociety.org. And but for everyone else, no, it'll be out in the world probably sometime in the next academic year, hopefully in the calendar year.
Good.
Anyway.
So moving then to the topic of rights, which is later in the speech than her presentation on trade and justice and force. It only comes toward the end when he's talking about how the strikers have gone on strike in the name of the principles that America was founded on, and then proceeds to articulate what those principles were, and begins with material that reflects on ideas that have come from the section in the speech on morality. So from his presentation of the morality of life, we get the idea that it's, of course, right for men to live for their own sake, to act as ends in themselves, and to treat other people as ends in themselves as well. That's part of the perspective that justice would bring to it. And so then he gets into what the concept of rights means and how it encodes this overall moral perspective, that that if we are ends in ourselves and need to live as such, there are certain necessary conditions for living in society that if are not fulfilled, we can't profit from society in the way that we would, learning and trade and so forth. And the basic condition that is required is, of course, freedom from initiated force, which is that negation of the mind previously referenced. And it goes a little further and kind of characterizes the status of this concept. What are we talking about when we're talking about a right? Is it just some kind of magical attribute that's bestowed upon us by God? Is it just a kind of social construct that is voted by Congress? No, he sees it as an application of the law of identity. And that's, I think some people find that difficult to interpret, but seen in the light of this overall speech, he's given us an overall portrayal of what man's identity is and what he needs to function, and why his mind is his basic means of survival, and why force is a negation of it, and so that is his identity as a being, and what he requires to live in society flows from it. And particularly noteworthy is a point that's also been a running theme in the book, which is the issue of the mind-body integration, that we can't detach the two of them, and that for the same reason we can't detach, say, the right to liberty on the one hand, which is often associated with freedom of the intellect, from the right to property, which is often associated with economic freedom and the freedom of the body and production. But of course, in Rand's view, mind and body are integrated, and so therefore so are so-called human rights and property rights, and that you can't have one without the other. And
we should mention maybe just Rand went on to write an essay called Man's Rights, which goes into a lot of the issues raised in this portion of the speech in more depth, and connects it with some other terminology she developed. And I think for people interested in exploring this idea more, that essay, which I think is available for free on the Institute's webpage, is
Google
really
Man's Rights, Ayn Rand.
a must-read for Ayn Rand's political philosophy, as is an essay on the topic. It's often paired with the essay The Nature of Government, which I think is also available for free online.
Man's Rights and the Nature of Government, sometimes abbreviated as Mr. Nog.
Mr. Nog? I hadn't seen that. I don't know that I care for that.
So then moving to what the implications of this are for political theory and the nature of government, if the basic condition we require for living in society is our protection and respect for our rights, then if there's a role for government, it's to protect those rights. It's to be an agency that engages in force only in retaliation against those initiated. And for Rand, what that means in concrete terms is police, the courts, the military, and nothing else. And we'll talk a little bit more later about why it is she does think there's a role for government, a positive role for it. But another way of looking at what she's talking about here is she's advocating laissez-faire capitalism. And it's interesting, Greg. Last night I was doing keyword searches in my Kindle. You know, the word capitalism doesn't appear even once in Atlas Shrugged. The word capitalist appears only once when Francisco is saying how he's been characterized as a greedy capitalist. But that is, of course, the overall political theory that is the foundation for what she regards as a proper system, which she later goes on to advocate very explicitly for in her nonfiction.
And the main book where most of her political essays are located is called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and she sometimes described it as a nonfiction footnote to Atlas Shrugged. So
she defined capitalism in one of her nonfiction essays as a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned, and elsewhere as a kind of separation of state and economics in the same way and for the same reasons as the separation of state and church, which I've always found is really compelling formulation.
That's the essay, What is Capitalism, if I'm not mistaken. I think those are the three key essays for Ayn Rand's political philosophy. Man's Rights, The Nature of Government, and What is Capitalism. Man's Rights and the Nature of Government are both available in The Virtue of Selfishness, her main collection on ethics, and then re-presented again in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So important did she regard them. And then this essay, What is Capitalism, is new for Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And those are the three I think I would recommend as the place to start, other than Galt's speech, for Ayn Rand's political philosophy.
Last major point, right after presenting her view on the role of government, there's a brief section talking about how only in a system governed in this way, where government's restricting its function to the protection of individual rights, does she think that you can have truly objective law, by which I think she means primarily that it's a law that's communicated clearly to people in advance, so they know what's permitted and what's forbidden, which is essential for the possibility of long-range rational action for the people who sign 99-year contracts, and that's part of, that rational producers live and function in the long range. That's part of what makes them rational. They're looking to the future in ways that shorter-term people don't, and even better people. And so and the objectivity, knowing what the rules of the game are, is something that they need to be able to plan that game in the long run.
And that means they have to not just be clearly written, but be coherent and consistent with one another. And that means they have to have some kind of common basis, so that you can and structure, so that if they seem to come into conflict, you can know which ones trump others. I mean, think of the way American law is now, right? We have an amendment that protects freedom of religion, as it should, and we have drug laws. And then you have people who say, well, it's part of my religion to take peyote or smoke pot or something. And how do you adjudicate those two things? It's just, do they get to do it because it's freedom of religion and it's essential to their religion to do, or they don't get to do it because the drugs are illegal? Well, if their religion was human sacrifice, they shouldn't be able to do that. But then we do think there should be exemptions for other things for churches. And if your laws aren't consistent and have a consistent basis, there's not a way to answer these questions. And you get the courts in all kinds of tangles. And you get the kind of problems that Judge Narragansett had, where he couldn't figure out how to proceed, and his decisions were reversed, and he felt the need to kind of edit the Constitution to fix these problems. Tara Smith has done a lot of good work on this issue. Tara Smith, a philosophy professor at the University of Texas. In Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which we're always plugging, Tara has an article called, I think, Humanity's Darkest Evil, or Man's Darkest Evil, a non-objective law, which is a kind of rumination on Judge Narragansett.
Lethal destructiveness of non-objective law.
The lethal destructiveness of non-objective. But what's the beginning part?
Humanity's Darkest Evil.
Humanity's Darkest Evil. So that's a riff on Judge Narragansett's claims about it. And also in the companion to Ayn Rand, which I did show and tell of earlier, Tara has a chapter on Rand's view of the objectivity of law, and contrasting it with a lot of other, or comparing and contrasting it with a lot of themes in more typical philosophy of law that you might get if you took a philosophy of law class in, well, a philosophy department or maybe a law school. Less likely there. So there's another recommendation for you.
So shall we move to the anarchy question?
Yeah, let's go.
So there are...
You were anticipating this with if there's a role for government. But there is a role for government.
Of course.
Yeah, so...
it's not a big revelation to point out that there are a lot of fans of Ayn Rand within the libertarian tradition who are anarchists, and who think that is the kind of next logical application of her views. Her views, you should remove all these different functions of government. Well, why not just take one more step and remove all of them? And some of them even get the idea that that there's something about that concept that's being endorsed by this book, especially when they look to the example of Mulligan's Valley and Galt's Gulch, especially when Mulligan himself says on page 747 of the Standard Edition, "We are not a state here, not a society of any kind. We're just a voluntary association of men held together by nothing but every man's self-interest. I own the valley and I sell the land to others when they want it. Judge Narragansett is to act as our arbiter. In cases of disagreement, he hasn't had to be called upon yet." So what they basically say is, look, they're living in a kind of anarchist utopia in Galt's Gulch. Why not? Why shouldn't we all do that?
So before we talk about the role of this in the novel and whether that's an anarchic society and not, just it's crystal clear that Rand regarded anarchism not just as wrong, but as an evil on par with communism or fascism. This is, in her view, an absurdly ridiculous and evil manner of social organization. It's not, in her view, something close to her view, but she's a little bit different, or these are two views in the same family. And whether or not she's right or wrong to think that way, I think she's right. But whether just as a matter of how she viewed it, these were not near relatives. There was nothing to do with it. And I think one of the reasons why she doesn't take care to erase or cancel these possible implications in Atlas Shrugged is she just didn't think anybody would frankly be so dumb as to think anybody could imagine you could combine capitalism with anarchism. She thought anarchism had traditionally been a leftist, anti-corporate, we should all go on a farm and wallow in the mud kind of a view, and she thought it should remain that way. David, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, the novel does depict roving gangs.
I was just going to...
committing criminal acts, and the government being too weak to be able to do anything with them. So that is an answer to the anarchist argument provided right there in the action of the book.
Yeah, and I've been trying to stress on a number of occasions a point that I originally got from Greg, that's not an accident, that and this is part of the reason why she didn't see anarchism as a totally different idea from socialism or statism, because she saw the two as mutually reinforcing, and that the more laws the government gets, the less it can enforce them, and that's a part of the problem.
Well, she was even more explicit than that when she first describes districts which arise in rebellion, then proceed to decree complete collectivism, the bondage of all to all, and cannibalizing themselves. That I wondered if she was thinking what you'd probably have known about the anarchists in Spain who did act pretty much like that, or perhaps closer to home, the Makhnovshchina in the Ukraine.
I don't know if she had either of those particular episodes in mind, but she was aware of these kinds of episodes occurring. And of course, she lived in the Crimea in a period after the Bolshevik Revolution where it kept on going back and forth between the Reds and the Whites. Yes, as David pointed out online and made a lot of comments about this. So she was certainly aware of these kinds of cases. And I should just say there's some good material in the companion that puts together her views on anarchism and for anyone, I don't really want to make this a session on this topic, but so many people think of it as an obvious thing that follows from some definition or other that they've pulled out of someplace, that objectivists are obviously libertarians and anarchism is obviously a species of libertarian. Google, I have an essay called What's Wrong with the Concept Libertarian that's up somewhere on the web that explains, I think, why, from Rand's perspective, this is a very misguided way to think. And whether I'm right about that or not, you should keep in mind that if you can just pull a definition out of somewhere and deduce something out of it, and it seems obvious that it's right to you, you should check your premises and think, well, where did I get this definition
that
from?
Essay is actually at checkyourpremises.org.
Yes, it's on checkyourpremises. Ben, can we just put it up in the chat notes for people?
Look that up.
I'm rather pleased with that essay, I have to say. It's a short blog post with a little bit of an off-color example, but I think it's useful, including the off-colorness of it to capture some points. And there's going to be a lot of material on this, I hope, going up soon from Ben. We were both at a conference in November, where Ankar, who was just with us in the last session, and I spoke a lot about these issues, and a few other speakers, and there was a lot filmed from that I think is going to go on the web pretty soon, right? Is that the plan?
Yes.
That's what we're told?
That's the plan.
Okay, so stay tuned for plenty more on anarchism. Did someone else want to talk? All right, let's move on to you had a bunch of ways to frame the anarchy point.
Right, well, so as if, even though I think you're right, she doesn't spend a lot of time trying to cancel the implication of that line. There's still plenty that one could pick up on if one looks. Like, for example, when Dagny comes into the valley for the first time and is paid her first wages in gold by Galt, I think it was Galt who gave it to her, she looks at both sides of it, and what do you see on it? They bore the head of the Statue of Liberty on one side, the words United States of America, $1 on the other. And then she asks, what's Midas doing minting gold? And she says, on whose authority? Mm-hmm. And he says, that's stated on the coin.
On both
sides of it. So there's at least the conception here, early vision of the fact that they see themselves as part of a country. They see themselves and subject to its authority. Now, there's a separate discussion to have about, well, what form does that take right now in this current situation that they're in? But
you might think of them as sort of castaways or exiles or the remnants of a country that's gone off its moorings, who are expecting to bring it back, and in the meantime are living in this strange arrangement on their own, but still replicating its law and system of society as they understand it.
And then to make it completely unambiguous, of course, at the very end, you get the Judge Narragansett rewriting the lines of the Constitution to include Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom and production of trade. Well, if there's a Congress, there's a legislature. If there's a legislature, there's a... So they clearly want to, as you've put it before, reestablish the United States according to its original principles, perfected to remove these contradictions. And so, yeah, it's true. They're not running a government in the valley. Mm-hmm. Keith in the chat said, well, they've got Judge Narragansett there, and that's true. But of course, he's also not ever had to been used. And
that's another element of the fantasy premise, by the way.
He's got the court, but he doesn't have a police officer or military yet.
Because I have a lot of friends who I think are by and large rational and share the same ideology, and I can't imagine 1,000 of them living together in a valley and never having call for arbitration.
I don't agree with you.
Damn it, Ben. Ed, can you settle this for us? No.
So, yeah, I don't think they have a government in the valley, but that's in part because of the very strange circumstances that they're living in the context of this novel, that there is a government outside of the valley. Now it's falling apart, and so they're kind of taking refuge for the moment, as you say, as kind of castaways, as a transitional measure, with the hope that eventually they can reestablish a proper government.
Yeah, and the valley came about, there wasn't originally a plan to have a valley, right? Mulligan bought some land, and then they started coming here, but there wasn't any goal of establishing a society here. Carrie Ann?
I was going to say, in some sense, see, it is Mulligan's valley, right? It was his property initially, so he probably rents, leases, or sold, right? There's a transfer of ownership, and they each have to take an oath. Mm-hmm. They all have to live, so there's certain rules that they had to agree to or be persuaded by before they could actually settle in the valley. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, there are already in place those kind of proto-laws that they've agreed to, that if their understanding is the best extension of the United States of America that they had recognized as authoritative before Galt went on the strike, that it was still good enough to live up to. Then I think there's a way to, by extension, say that, well, they really are guided by certain principles and laws, rules of sorts that are sufficient for the purposes of the time being.
And you can think of it like a private club or like a condo situation,
Condo is what I use. Yeah. But they're not laws; they're rules.
Right.
Yeah. The rules are guides.
They're rules and they're contractual.
Agreed on principles and whatnot, but they're definitely not laws. What I argue with libertarians is that law, by definition, is a function of government. Mm-hmm. Libertarianism advocates lawlessness. Lawlessness leads to anarchy. Anarchy leads to death.
Yeah, I mean, different. there are those who would say that there's a kind of law that can be a social custom this way, but I don't think that's true. So
And they have answers to these arguments,
Yeah.
but they get further and further detached from reality when they make them, and it turns into a real weird intellectual game. I've had the privilege on recent occasion to filter through some of their texts, and
Alex, did you want to make a comment, and then Anna in the back?
Well, the purpose of the government is to protect the Dagneys and the Hanks from people who want to impose force upon them. People who want to impose force on others would not have been invited into the valley. So while this kind of arrangement is possible among a group of friends that know and trust each other, on a wide scale it would be impossible to implement. So that is why government is necessary.
I think I like the fact that you're bringing it back to protecting Hank and Dagny, because part of what that underscores is that the purpose of the purpose of government, in Rand's view, it's important in a way that distinguishes it from anarchist views, is not as a necessary evil, that it's a necessary good for the sake of protection of the good. And you get what that good is really well illustrated
And I
in
think,
a book like this. They need government more than anybody else.
At a societal level, I don't. There's a view, and it was shared by some of America's founders, that we only need government because people have vices, and some people will go and aim to attack you, and so you need a government to protect you.
Men were angels.
If men were angels, we wouldn't need it. I don't think that's true from Rand's perspective exactly, because even if everybody has the best of intention, there are possible misunderstandings and disagreements, and there's a need to have recourse in case you doing your best think this belongs to you, and I doing my best think it belongs to me, and how other than coming to blows can we settle that?
Look how much disagreement there is between Galt and Dagny, even though they're the most rational people.
Yeah. So it's not only it's not only because there might be bad people there that you would need a government, but here we have a small community of people who share the same values, are friends, agreed to buy the land on a certain terms from somebody else, and who are living in a work of fiction where these kinds of conflicts arise less than they do between real people. And that's part of the setup of the premise for the work of fiction, that we can get all these people agreeing to this strike. Is there popcorn popping? What?
Making ice.
Something's making ice. Okay. You can see the kinds of things that come up when rational people agree to have an event in a certain place, and then the ice maker isn't. These things happen. People get bothered. Anna?
Okay, so one example of a definite disagreement that exists in the valley is the nature of what Ragnar was doing, and that's
Mhm.
also relevant. And he was protecting Hank. There's a great scene about how he's explaining that his goal is to reimburse Hank for his loss. So I was wondering, is there anything else about what was protected by Ragnar that could point to even his deliberate acting as a pirate?
Well, isn't there a point?
It shows that he believes that there's a law. There should be laws. There should be justice.
Isn't there an exchange between him and Reardon when they're walking alone together in the country? When the police are dedicated to looting, then the criminals must become the police. So it's clearly a recognition of the need for police.
Yeah. And that is what I am in point of fact, Mr. Reardon, your bodyguard, and will deserve to be, so that's right. Go ahead.
Following the example of the real Robin Hood, if there was one, against the Hollywood version of him.
But not just the Hollywood. I think a lot of stories of Robin Hood that were published in modern times, not just in the movies.
You can blame Howard Pyle too.
Howard Pyle, okay. Who has Robin Hood just robbing from the rich to give to the poor? Yeah. Al?
Could you possibly comment on the relationship between, on the one hand, metaphysical individualism and autonomy as it applies to human beings? On the other hand, ethics of selfishness and how those relate to freedom. I'm thinking specifically of Christians and some Jews who say, we believe that people are individuals. We also believe in altruism, but you don't get moral points unless your altruism you're giving is voluntary. So it's wrong for government to take your property and give it to others.
Well, I'm not sure what you'd like me to comment on about that. I mean, that's a view that some people hold. that I don't agree with, and I don't think Rand
I
agreed
have
with.
a few
Do you want
thoughts
to
on
say?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so one issue is that there's a definitely an important connection between Rand's view of free will and her view of individual freedom in politics. I mean, part of what makes us metaphysically individuals and not connected to some kind of collective organism, and this is a point that we've had some discussions about recently, is precisely the fact that we have free will and we have the ability to do otherwise and break free from our social pressures. And whereas there are animals, unlike men, who do exist in kinds of collectives where you could imagine something like ants and bees. That's in fact how they survive. And so individual rights then identify the conditions necessary for being who lives in that very distinctive way, as opposed to the way that ants and bees live.
For such a being to coexist. Ben, could you arrange that screen so that we could see the comments on the right? Because I'm seeing comments but not seeing who they're from.
Right.
If I could look over. Okay, so Robert Mayu is pointing out that Rand discusses this in the Q&A, and I'm not sure, Robert, if the this you're referring
this
to
is back to the anarchism.
This is back to the anarchism issue?
discussion.
Okay.
I can't remember which Q&A he means here, but
Okay.
that's when he posted it. The other thing I wanted to say quickly about your question is that yes, I think you're right that there's a lot of religious ideologies who say that you only get credit for your virtue if you're doing it voluntarily. But I think that when you push these ideologies, there's serious questions about whether they really can allow for the possibility of true free will when there's a God that's determining everything that they do. And there's a lot more I could say about that, but maybe talk about it later.
No?
Oh, Robert has.
Oh, yeah, Robert.
I have a nitpicking point that it's clear she's against anarchism, but in the scene when Galt is at the Wade Falkland with Mr. Thompson, he's making him the economic dictator, and Thompson's asking for ways to take over, and Galt says, abolish all income taxes, and then Thompson says, how will we pay our government employees? And then Galt says, fire your government employees. And he's not distinguishing, is that all government employees? Is that only income tax holders? So it's just...
Yeah, there's a lot about what she thinks a proper government would look like, or what Galt must think a proper government would look like, that's just not discussed here, and that you might expect to be discussed. So, like later on, she wrote an essay about how government financing in a free society, which is in the Virtue of Selfishness, that talks about how such a society would work. Robert's pointing us to pages in the Ayn Rand's Cute Questions and Answers book. This is the book Ayn Rand Answers, edited by Robert Mayhew, which is a condensed version, a condensed and ordered topically version of answers she gave in question and answer periods. So a portion of, for example, of the answer we listened to earlier is in there, but instead of having each question and answer period in full, Robert found the answers or parts of answers that were thematically related and organized.
He's referring to
very
the
well.
one about how she doesn't think Gulch is an instance of anarchy.
Right.
And I should, to connect it to the question that Robert's asking, it's interesting because there are a lot of anarchists who will argue that, well, the same reason that prompts Rand to be opposed to the income tax should be the reason that would lead her to be an anarchist, because don't you have to fund a government through taxes? And yet, as Greg's pointing out, she's got this essay, how government financing in a free society points to ways in which one could finance it voluntarily while maintaining its status as a monopoly on force.
But interesting, she didn't feel the need to say any of that in Atlas Shrugged. Now, maybe she didn't have those ideas yet and she developed them later, but even so, even if that were the case, she didn't feel the need to address those issues in this novel. And I think that's really interesting, and it tells you a lot about what kind of a novel this is. This is, in a pretty serious sense, not a political novel. So it's not just that it's not primarily a political novel. It's not a political novel in the sense that it's not about how to organize the laws of a country and how to set up a government and what should a legislature be like and is voting rights important and so forth. It's not about the political process. It's not about the political structure. It's about the moral principles underlying a society, which have a tremendous influence on and require a certain type of politics as opposed to another, and on how the wrong moral principles are leading to the wrong kind of political structures. But it's operating at that level of abstraction and depth about the moral code of a society, and it's just sort of sketching or indicating the political consequences of the political implications of the right moral code, and is saying in much more detail the political consequences of the bad moral code, because we're seeing them playing out in the society. But the answers she gives and the answers Galt gives are at the level of reject altruism, reject the use of force, and then we'll build a society based on rights. And that will require something like the Constitution, but with some modifications. If there were a sequel novel, not that there should or could be one, and I think Rand would be very opposed to a sequel because she's finished the point she wanted to make in this novel in this universe. But if you imagine a novel that was about a group of people with Galt-like ideas first setting up a society in a wilderness, or a continent filled with all kinds of people, some of them sympathetic to them, some of them not, and who should they admit into the society and how should they do it, and do they have cities with walls connected by trains, or do they set up, and is there a legislature, and what does it take to get citizenship, and how do they get internal revenues and so forth. You could imagine the kinds of questions that would be asked if you had a novel about building a society. This is a novel about the moral code behind our current society, what's wrong with it, how human life and everything good in human life requires and comes from an opposite way of thinking, an opposite moral code, how by insisting on that and not sanctioning the wrong moral code, one could bring down a society that's based on the wrong moral code, and then would be free, the road would be clear to build a proper society. But it's not about how to build a proper society, and that's why we get so little on this. I mean, surprisingly little from an author who had a decent amount to say about it elsewhere, right?
So should we get to that elsewhere?
Sure.
Application of some of this to more contemporary politics. There's a lot that we can discuss about politics post-Atlas that she observes in the form of her nonfiction writing.
Well, let me just say this one thing. That if we distinguish the kinds of levels we talked about earlier, ethics as it might apply even if you were all on your own on a desert island. Ethics then, once we bring in the interpersonal element that you're dealing with other people. And then ethics insofar as it's shaping the structure of a society and the terms on which people interact as a social level. And then, finally, politics as shaping the institutions of government and so forth, and the principles for that. I think this is a novel that has a lot to say about the first three of those levels. It's the fourth level, the specific political institutions, should we have a unicameral legislature, is federalism important, these kinds of things, who would make the laws, that are who gets a vote and so forth. That's what's specifically political science. That's just not a part of this. All that's a part of it is the very foundational principles of it.
Though there are objectivist legal philosophers who are working on some of these questions today.
Mm-hmm.
We've been in a number of conferences where there's a lot of debates going on about some of these very issues.
Oh, one other thing that we can notice about the law is clearly it's a world where intellectual property rights are considered an important part of property rights. After all, one of the most evil things is the taking of Rearden metal away from Rearden, that's what gets Ragnar.
And which is in contrast to what a lot of these anarchist libertarians often maintain. They think intellectual property is a form of government theft.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, but go on, please.
So there's a long-standing question, and this became particularly salient in 2008, 2009, whether or not Atlas Shrugged is prophetic about the course of politics and economics in the later 20th, early 21st century. I think there was even a rather interesting documentary made about this, The Prophecy of Atlas Shrugged. I enjoyed that movie. Though it's I think, also interesting to look and see what Rand herself had to say about, during her lifetime, whether these predictions were coming true.
One thing that's really interesting, from the quote that we listened to earlier, I edited that down only a little bit from a longer question. And the longer question, the question began, it was a little hard to hear the question. You present ideal solutions to these problems in your novels. Then it went right on to, in Atlas Shrugged, you do such and such, this is the ideal solution. But in the question as it stood, the questioner also asked about her first novel, We the Living. And I edited that part out and Ayn Rand's answer out because I didn't want to give spoilers about We the Living. We're a no spoiler group and we haven't read that book. But one of the things she said in the We the Living book is she said, we're not now in a dictatorship here. And this is 1961. And the way she said it is, Kennedy's not a dictator yet. And if he doesn't get to be one, it's not going to be through his own doing. It'll be because people resist the kind of moves he's making.
But to background on the yet there was that she was highly critical of the Kennedy administration.
Yes, that's why I'm
considered them
bringing
to
it up.
be part of a fascist new frontier, which is
she thought Kennedy was a fascist.
that got her
And
essay kicked out of
was really
mythology.
concerned about Kennedy moving America in the direction of fascism and moving it in that direction quickly. And the Kennedy and Johnson administration she regarded as a real horror. And that's itself a really interesting phenomenon. She did not have a consistent view, a consistent across time of the culture all through her life as being exactly the same, and exactly the same in relation to Atlas Shrugged, nor did you see it as progressively and always at the same pace getting worse. She saw there as different threads. She was particularly horrified in the early 60s by certain developments in the Kennedy administration, its approach to ideas. She saw it as a major eroding away of the kind of concept that helped distinguish between a free and an unfree society. And she regarded the swing to the right in the 68 and especially 72 elections against McGovern as a major positive turning point in the country, a sign that the country was rejecting this movement. Unfortunately, she didn't think it was rejecting it with the kind of intellectuality needed. It wasn't breaking with everything that was behind this movement, but it was a sign that this movement had gone too far in this direction. The country wasn't ready to take it. And so it was good, and it was buying us a lot of time. We weren't going to hell in a handbasket as quickly. However, the intellectual doctrines she thought were continuing to progress very badly. And so there's a complicated, nuanced view of what's happening in American history, what's getting better and what's getting worse over this period.
One of the things I think is really interesting about the complexity there is that, especially in her critique of Kennedy and Johnson administrations, it's not just that there's this, she sees this heavy-handed authoritarian bullying of industries, though that's a big part of it. It's that the anti-ideological perspective that they bring to it, which you've written a fair amount about, has the effect of disintegrating the country into these warring pressure groups, where you start to see a kind of anarchy creeping into the system, just as the statism is creeping in.
You also see one of the things she was particularly concerned about with Kennedy was him singling out particular businesses by name and trying to intimidate them. And I think this is something that we've seen more of under Obama than we had seen under previous presidents, and more of under Trump than we've seen under Obama. And this is something I think that's concerning in the present context. But Kennedy did things, he had FBI agents call up and get steel manufacturers out of bed at the middle of the night because he said there shouldn't be a steel price increase, and there were really some daunting things that happened. And if you read her articles from the early 60s, she's worried about an imminent slide into dictatorship in a way that she was not in the 70s. She thought there was a lot bad in the country in the 70s, but the pace of that happening, I think she thinks it.
But we should also keep in mind that in spite of the fact that she saw the rejection of the Democrats in 68 in favor of Nixon as a sign of hope, it's then under the Nixon administration that the price and wage controls get imposed, and she writes an article about this called The Moratorium on Brains, which she draws parallels to
Directive 10-289, which is, again, the worst law in Atlas. So she had a lot negative to say about all of these administrations. But this came up in the context of The Companion with John David Lewis, who's since passed away. He and I wrote an essay on her commentary on the events of her time. And my impression going into it was, there's a lot of stuff that she thinks is really bad that's happening, and this is horrible. That's the worst thing ever. And can I find a thread through it? Is she just always complaining about everything, or is there some good news, or are some things worse than others, or are there particular stages at which she thinks the bottom falls out? And there is, if you look through it, a thread of there's a time when there's a particular menace in her view from the administration that gets stemmed, but so that short-term risk is gone, but there's still a longer-term cultural trend in the wrong direction. And I think that essay, I found writing that essay really useful. That's chapter 15 of A Companion to Ayn Rand. And for anyone thinking about her view of these questions of how these principles of Atlas relate to American history, I think it's very helpful.
I find it interesting that at the very end of the book, when the country's falling apart and you get the description of the various states seceding, in California, you've got the People's Party led by the Oriental mystics, Chalmers, versus
soybean cult, yeah.
versus Back to God, led by a former oil producer. And if that's not a crystallized essence of what our politics has in effect become, I don't know what.
And
else.
That is really prophetic.
And
So
she
this is
didn't. And this wasn't happening.
1957.
The Back to God was not a big
Yeah,
thing.
this was 1950, before the rise of significant religious right. She was concerned, incidentally, about the takeover by the professional religionists, as she put it, of the Republican Party already in 1964, and was writing a Goldwater thing. How could you have someone from the National Review ghostwriting your book? These people are the equivalent of the socialists taking over the Democratic Party, and we can't have that on the right. But 57, I mean, that is really...
And a lot of it came out of California.
Yeah.
With Reagan versus everybody else. So that is noteworthy.
That is...
Today it would be the ecologist, the deep ecologist.
Yeah, but I mean that's practically what it already is with this soybean view.
And yeah, it's a... Think of what the soybean cult is saying, right? A lot of people think that wheat isn't really necessary for a culture. The simpler foods of the Orient on which people subsisted. So this idea of which you also saw happening in the 60s, but wasn't really happening in the 50s, right? So if you think about the communists of the 40s and 50s, there's this idea a planned economy is going to lead to abundance. The Soviets who are really going to have technology. The factories are going to be so much more efficient. This is what's really going to take off and produce abundance, not capitalism. The controlled economy is the economy that's really going to work well. By the late 60s, it's clear that that's not happening, right? And so you have the idea of, well, producing a lot isn't good from people who are sympathetic to the statist cause, right? We want a simpler life. Here we have greedy capitalism, which is separating us from the simple things in nature, and that you're getting in the ecology movement of the 60s, in a lot of modern leftism, and we're seeing that in Chalmers' soybean cult.
Yeah.
So the things that are prophetic, I think, are less actual political developments, although there are some of less. A certain law got passed, or there was an economic downturn, but more the character of the social movements, how they progress, given the kind of logic behind them.
I should mention, by the way, that on this topic of soybeans and agriculture, that my colleague at the Ayn Rand Institute, Amanda Maxim, has done some good work, and some of it's forthcoming on environmentalist opposition to genetically modified organisms, which reads right out of Chalmers, and why she does a very good job, I think, exposing it and showing why Reardon would love GMOs, basically. Businessmen. Speaking of which,
go ahead.
Do we want to get to that?
Yeah.
There's an essay that she wrote, a nonfiction essay in that collection that you referenced before, Capitalism in an Ideal, called Businessmen, America's Persecuted Minority.
I think it's the opposite. It's America's Persecuted Minority,
Right.
Big Business.
Right.
It's a more dramatic title that way.
Which is a dramatic title because it's and she's writing this in the 60s when the persecuted minorities that she's talking about, that most other people are talking about, are racial minorities, and I should mention she herself was sympathetic to the cause of this of the civil rights movement to a significant extent. She thought there was institutionalized racism in the South and it needed to be overturned.
Should mention in this same 1961 interview that we heard an excerpt from earlier, this is the interview behind after one of her deliveries of the lecture Faith and Force, and you can buy that. I think stream that whole lecture online from the Ayn Rand Institute at SoundCloud. She's asked. This is in '61, so several years before the full flowering of the civil rights movement. Right? She's asked about it and about the state of blacks in the South and so forth, and she has, is adamant about the segregation laws needing to be overturned and so forth.
But so without minimizing that issue, at the same time, she wants to draw attention to the fact that if it's the concerns of oppressed minorities that we think that we're concerned about, why do we have a blind eye for the oppression of a minority that is oppressed not because it's weak and powerless and downtrodden, but precisely because it's powerful and good and brings life to the world, and that of course is businessmen. And there's any number of ways in which this is portrayed in the novel. It might also be interesting to talk about how this applies to our political scene today.
In other words, this is a theme that she had been on about for decades by this time. So there was a period in the 40s when she was writing in Hollywood, and she was very concerned about communist propaganda, and not obvious communist propaganda where someone's saying how great the USSR is, but just like every time you see a businessman in a film, he's a crook. And you never see a good businessman. And every other profession or every other type of person, you make sure that you don't show only bad ones and no good ones. But businessmen, it seems like it was purposely being done this way, or she thought it that way. And there's evidence in retrospect that it was.
To a large extent today, I think.
But she became involved in an organization that was trying to counter this, and she wrote some pamphlets describing, how you should, if you're a Hollywood studio boss, be aware for people trying to smuggle propaganda into your movies. And it was a lot of you wouldn't portray any other small group as all evil, and you wouldn't portray a motive that's inherent in their way of action as evil. So don't portray businessmen or the profit motive this way. And interestingly, this is in the biographical interviews and hasn't been really. I haven't seen this published. It might be somewhere. She thought that those pamphlets were very effective. She thought that within a few months of that, you stopped seeing this. It's not like businessmen were portrayed wonderfully now, but she thought there was a period in the 40s where it was sort of rampant and just there was this incredible slant in almost every movie, and that dropped out as a result of the activities she thinks of the Motion Picture Alliance, which she was part of in her pamphlet. So that's another issue. Some of these better turns in the culture, right, are things that it's not just an accident that certain catastrophes were averted. It's that people were fighting back against them for the right principles. Sometimes of them
because of her.
With a philosophical understanding, her own, or other people who, whether at the level of philosophy or economics, were pretty deep thinkers about this. People like Ludwig von Mises, who she admired very much in economics, not so in moral philosophy. But people who were fighting back on some kind of principle at whatever level of depth, and then also just people who didn't have the principle but had a sense of life reaction against what they saw as overbearing authority.
And this is part of the reason why she emphasizes in that answer that we listened to that there's no historical determinism, right? So even if some of the things that she's writing about, some people could interpret as prophecy. Prophecy implies determinism. Prophecy implies this is bound to happen, but it's very important for her that we have free will.
And so it's not just
we can change our course.
No historical determinism. People might change their course. It's always there's no determinism. What are you going to do about it, right? You have to be the responsible builders of a new culture if there's going to be a new culture. If Mr. Kennedy doesn't do this, it's going to be because of you. People who push back against it. Some of them with a full philosophical understanding, some without that, but with a pretty good principled understanding of a free market economy, someone like von Mises or Henry Hazlitt in her view, and some of them without that, but like the people who came up to guard the first train of the John Galt line, people who have some sense of Americanism and freedom, and they can't articulate why, but they'll fight back against certain things, or they'll rally around the good in certain cases without a full understanding of it, or without much understanding of it.
Well, shall we talk about the persecuted businessmen today?
Yeah,
Because I think that we especially...
Or Ashley, are you trying to get a word in? I wasn't.
I thought you were wrapping up the persecuted businessmen, so I want to say something on that piece, but
Yeah,
Oh,
you can
go
talk
ahead.
about the businessman. Go ahead.
so this actually gets to, so one of my pet peeves is when everybody thinks that Ayn Rand says everything that I ever thought before, and my first response is, that's not true. But I think it is for some people, but one of the things that I think she does also is that she portrays businessmen in a way they never have been before. So I think in addition to having these values that we share kind of in common with her, I think there might be some people who don't necessarily. It's just that they've never kind of put certain kinds of values together. They've never kind of thought about productivity in a certain way. So it's also kind of the presentation of this alternative vision you've never seen before, not just putting words to what you always believed. And so kind of in the group that I'm running, the local chapter, something that I thought was really interesting was that one of our first-time readers was constantly thinking about Rockefeller as a counterpoint to what was going on in the novel. And the first time I introduced this idea, is it possible that he's a Reardon? Is it possible? I mean, we need to think about this, but that all the language that's being directed at, Reardon and this kind of thing, that's precisely why we have the view of Rockefeller that we do, that we just kind of come to assume certain things about business, and that's how they're typically portrayed in that.
And about particular businessmen
Exactly,
as well.
yeah. And so that whole concept of, I shouldn't just kind of bring my concepts of, to me, like, typical persecuted businessmen, or, the robber barons and those kinds of things, and there's, of course, modern versions of it. But sometimes we kind of take our own categories and then we're not really using the novel to kind of reevaluate that. So it was just kind of this interesting concept to me of realizing that the novel wasn't just naturally making her kind of rethink that category, but that was a powerful thing to do, to present what a businessman is in a different way. And I just think also related to this idea of just encouraging Hollywood to kind of present businessmen differently.
I should say that one of the things that I found really compelling about Atlas the first time I read it, and I was coming to this from having been a formerly fairly left-wing liberal, was the portrayal of the spiritual inner life of business people, which I had never thought to consider. That I thought that if you cared about inner spiritual life, you wanted to fight for free speech and the right to express yourself creatively. It had never occurred to me that there was a creative aspect to material production, and that was so searing to me that I had to rethink my whole view about freedom. And this connects back to the issue of human rights and property rights that we discussed earlier, and how when you see mind and body as unified, you no longer have the basis for a dichotomy like that, and therefore you come to see businessmen as an exemplar of creative production on par with the greatest of creative artists.
And Rand had this view of this tremendous injustice that had been done to businessmen, both to particular businessmen, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and many others who aren't, as well known, but also to the whole profession. This is. She spoke about what a tremendous benevolent society is possible in that quote we heard from her. And America almost had it in the 19th century. And if you heard discussions of the 19th century, particularly the period from the end of the Civil War to, into the 20th century, till about a little before World War I, are glowing. She says it's almost like a science fiction utopia. And if you look at what happened during that period, standard of living, it's just this incredible skyrocketing. And at one level, what's responsible for that is freedom. Political freedom, but political freedom is responsible for it by creating conditions in which people like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Fulton, a lot of different people, right, could produce abundance in new ways, apply their minds, can do the kind of thing we see Dagny and Reardon doing in the novel. And nobody gives, and this is the Gilded Age, the robber barons, there was child labor, all of these as though children weren't laboring, then dying laboring on farms all the damn time before this. And this just tremendous injustice against these people is something that really animated her. And you can see it. She has an essay called The Robber Barons, where she talks about this. You can see it in Atlas Shrugged, particularly not even in the portrayal of Hank Rearden, but in the portrayal of Nat Taggart, and the idea of Dagny who would look at him like, in this religious
Were you
awe.
the one who made the point to me about the Leonard Reed essay, I Pencil? And do you remember how it applies here?
I have made that point. I also noticed Yaron made it on
the
his podcast just the other day, and I don't think you're wrong. I mean, I think it's a point that's obvious from an Ayn Rand perspective. But this is a contrasting Ayn Rand to some of the better free market type of thinkers. So there's a famous essay by Leonard Reed called I Pencil. And there's also a very nice video of it, by Milton Friedman. That's a kind of take on the same point. And what happens in the film, or in the video, it's narrated from the perspective of a pencil, which is odd. And in the film, Milton Friedman just picks up a pencil and starts talking about it. But the point that's made in both cases is there's all this stuff that goes into a pencil. A pencil involves the coordination of work of God knows how many people from God knows how many places. The rubber from one place and the little bit of metal that goes around it and the wood and the graphite in the wood. They come from different parts of the world. Different people had to mine them. Someone had to take them over and get them. The machine that put them together had parts, and the parts had to come from somewhere. There were all these workers. Someone had to provide their food. If you think of all the people without whom, all of whose work go into making the pencil from scratch, from whatever the natural elements are that no one worked on to produce a pencil. God knows how many, and no one knows how many. Right? People, thousands and thousands, and it's only through through the system of free trade that these people who might hate each other or not know each other, their work can be coordinated into the production of a pencil. And this essay makes this point that with stressing the idea that nobody knows how to make a pencil, because nobody knows all of the factors that go involved. And so the idea, the way Leonard Reed and to some extent Milton Friedman make the point is, capitalism comes about, you have free trade, and this spontaneous order comes up, which is this Hayek phrase. And the pencils just come about. People do things, each pursuing their own interest, and somehow pencils come about, even though nobody knows how to make them by the magic of invisible hands somewhere or something. And that is blanking out that someone figured out they didn't know how to make every damn part, but they figured out you can put rubber together and someone knows how to make rubber, and I can coordinate that. There's entrepreneurs. There's someone whose job it is to figure out how, in a free society, to coordinate people, first to make a rubber plant and a lumberjack place and a machine that does it. And that role of the entrepreneurs is missing from most economics, including most Austrian or free market economics and Chicago School economics. It's as though in freedom this magic just happens, as though moral virtue wasn't responsible for it. And that is a tremendous injustice. Yaron was talking about this just the other day on the radio show, on his podcast, and made some very good points about it, including mentioning the couple of people in economics who are much better on this point in recognizing the role of the businessman. Israel Kirzner, who writes about the role of entrepreneurial insight and so forth.
But I take it that the valid point that's kind of in the wings of that argument is that the pricing system does play an important function in communicating information among traders and entrepreneurs and integrating supply with demand.
There's an important and right economic point made there, but it's made in a way that is, though true, is ignoring the role of the people who use this system.
And it's interesting the way the mistake that it makes is basically the mirror image of the same mistake that kind of left-wing economists make when they say, well, we're all interdependent and nobody's truly independent. Nobody knows how to make a pencil. It's just another way of saying it's true you couldn't make it from scratch by reinventing all of the principles that went into it, but that makes it seem like it's a trivial thing to figure out how to put these together, when in fact that's the essence of what all creativity is in Rand's view. It's rearrangement of existing elements, and not everybody knows how to do that.
There's you didn't build that behind the I-pencil perspective on things. Really? Right, and you ought to keep the profits of it, because only by this profit system can society at large spontaneously arrange itself so that pencils pop out of machines and get shipped to places with number 2 stamped on them. But there's no moral perspective to it. And that is unjust, at least in Rand's view and in my view, as you can tell by my being emphatic about it. Robert?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of connect the idea of the great 19th century industrialist with Jed Starnes, the character of Jed Starnes.
Yeah, another example.
He's a great businessman, but he's an awful father. And his offspring basically they destroyed the town. He should have had a better estate planning manager to not have his money go to them. And is she thinking of the Rockefellers, all these the offspring that have become ultra
That's
leftist?
really interesting question.
Any thoughts on that?
I don't know biographically if she thought of that, although there is this point which I mentioned before. In the very early planning of the novel, Reardon was going to be older, and the Philip character was going to be his son. And she changed that and made Philip his younger brother, who was younger enough that he had supported him through college, because there was kind of like a father-son relationship. But she made him younger because she realized, well, she could have the affair with Dagny. And once she realized that part of Reardon's character arc would be this development over sex, and that therefore there was to be an affair with Dagny, then that changed what age the character was to make it a more plausible relationship. But if that were the case, then you'd have a Reardon with a Philip son would be, an example of Jed and his the same kind of way of thinking. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, there were numerous examples in the 1800s of families where the father was the entrepreneur that built the company, and they would they called it rags to rags in 3 generations.
Church
where
sleeves.
the father was started poor, and then they spoiled brats eventually took over and destroyed the company. So that happened an awful lot in the 1800s. That knowledge of history was around.
Good, thank you, Paul. Yeah. So again, whether or not she had it. See, we wanted to talk about some present businessmen, Ben. I'm not sure why my thing has gone up. Okay.
So I could not help but think about this novel when I saw Mark Zuckerberg on trial. It wasn't a trial. It was though it felt like one, testifying before Congress the other day, and I mean, there's a lot there are a lot of good questions you can ask about how well Facebook's been running its business, and even more questions about whether it's been fair to how it treats people from different ideological perspectives and so forth. And certainly it's plausible that there's a lot of left-wing bias that goes into some of those decisions. But for the various senators and congressmen to sit there and to expect that Zuckerberg is going to make his social media platform conform to their various arbitrary decrees as if this were a trivial matter, and to sit there watching it being broadcast on Facebook, where various people are dumping on him in the comment section in Facebook, which is the very platform that he brought to us. Yeah. I find that as a tremendous
And it's not just these disgusting phenomena in Congress, but a lot of people on Facebook are there, just bitching about it. Basically, stop using it if you don't like the damn thing. This guy's not making you use Facebook, or start your own and see what you can do if you know how to do it better. The amount of people who are ingrates to Silicon Valley is disgusting, and I can't be emphatic enough about how this is. Whatever other issues there are with these people, and there are a lot of character flaws of a lot of the people in this area. This is the equivalent of Colorado. This is the area that there wasn't expected to be suddenly, this is where the economy reshifted to, and that now everyone's sights are on, trying to destroy Facebook, Amazon, Google. Again, not that any of these companies are beyond reproach in any respect, nor was Reardon, but these are the people who are creating our standard of living, who, God knows where America's economy would be if you just, the people who think if America got rid of California, we would suddenly be some kind of better country. If America got rid of California, there would be, if there was not for California and New York City, there'd be no America. This is where almost all of the economic production is. There are, the other states produce a couple of things, but America is serious. So much of the country's productivity is the financial industry in New York, the venture capital in Silicon Valley, all of these tech companies, and there is nicely a kind of for a couple of these figures, a lionization of Jobs and a few other people who are stylish and people, there is a nice element in the culture that admires them. But there's not this kind of moral heroizing of it or lionizing of it that I think you would have if there was an Ayn Rand around writing. And there's a lot of just, for lack of a more dignified term, crapping all over these business people by ingrates who are only able to do it, and probably in a lot of cases only able to have any kind of job in whatever field they're in, because of these atlases.
The quality of their questions revealed further the ignorance that they have.
Well, that was
how to
true
use
with the congressmen, and it was interesting that it was congressmen from both sides of the aisle, including a lot of people who people think are some kind of free marketers, like Ted Cruz, who was particularly shameful, and Lindsey Graham, but the left was just both sides of the aisle. There were, I should say, a few better people on both sides of the aisle who were more respectful. But
and let's also not forget Jeff Bezos, because he's now been shamed and bullied by a variety of players as well, including the president, for the sin of making the USPS his delivery boy. Excuse me, he's giving them business. Not only that, but Amazon is, I read recently, one of the leading provider of cloud data services for the U.S. federal government.
For the whole world. The
Amazon
whole
Web Service.
world.
And as if in a poetic demonstration of this, the other evening, Tuesday night, what happens but that the IRS servers go down. Yes,
Yeah.
we'll tax you if we give you the web services for it.
Yeah. Bezos, I think, is a particular, and if you read about some of the Amazon memos from early on when he was starting this company, this is somebody who really had foresight. He's really a kind of heroic innovator. And it's not just, Trump in particular has some vendetta against him, I think because he reminds Trump of what he's not, but it's not just,
Because he owns the Post.
and because he owns the Post. I think those are two things, yeah. But prior to that, the left always had its eyes on Amazon. So it's not, this isn't a one particular candidate or president. There's a lot of animosity towards this company, and I think precisely for its virtues.
But then let's be fair, though, because at the same time, it's not just that people like
Well, there's
Zuckerberg.
one other we should mention, because it's not current, but it's probably the biggest example of this, and that's Microsoft.
Yeah.
And what Bill Gates was as a business person is, I don't think people remember or know. And it wasn't just that he was brilliant in forming Microsoft. He was really prescient on the role of intellectual property in software, that there could be such a thing as a software company that was a major productive value if only people started recognizing software as property. If you read, there's a letter in the 70s from Bill Gates to the Homebrew Computer Club, which is just, I want to bring to your attention the fact that you steal all your software, and if people didn't steal software, we could have professionally made software and flood the world with it. And he predicted just what they would do. It was, and if you think about the complaints about Microsoft at its peak, right, that, the problem with Microsoft is that they, in effect, they're not the best software makers. They have the best business model. As though creating a good business model wasn't a productive achievement, as though vertically integrating and as though creating a software ecosystem wasn't an achievement. This is the same kind of hatred of business that we see, hatred of real achievement that we see in Atlas with Reardon, that on Rand's view we saw in the 19th century with Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, and if you, one other just direct reference to this, Google Bill Gates's depositions in the antitrust case against him. There are hours of them online of him answering these creepy creatures who try to, the fact that this man has to spend any time in the room with these things, trying to catch him up in stupid sophisms when he could be producing world-changing value. And if you learn about what happened to Microsoft in the decades since, their whole software development teams had to be taken off of developing software to write things to help their competitors, precisely because they were too successful at developing software. And this is, you can't make a fiction example that is more evil and more destructive of this kind of thinking than what happened to Microsoft. And it destroyed the company. And if you look at what happened to Gates personally, I think it's really very tragic. And there's
But
a
yeah,
beautiful interview with him and Jobs, which is mostly uplifting and positive, from after Jobs came back to Apple, reflecting on their times together and how they were adversaries and so forth. But there's one point in the interview at which it's talking about Jobs' second act when he came back to Apple and how people are lionizing him. And Gates reflects, in effect, maybe I shouldn't have gone out of the computer business. I'm always going to be a computer guy deep down. And yeah, sure, I'm curing malaria, but that's no big deal. By compared to, and the way you can see something in his affect there that I think is really telling about what happened to him
and
he left computers.
that gets to the last thing I wanted to discuss about this, because I'm watching this hearing, and I didn't have any expectation that Mark Zuckerberg was going to be able to pull a Hank Rearden like Rearden did at his trial. But it's not just, well, I wish they could be more like Rearden in that respect, but it's also to observe that they're like Rearden, even when he's giving this speech, they don't realize what they are conceding to their enemies. And so Zuckerberg is saying, well, we're not opposed to regulations, we just want to have good and smart regulations. And then to the example of Gates, I mean, he didn't put up, it's not just that he didn't put up a moral fight in defense of Microsoft, though sundry few objectivists were at the time. It's that he then went on, as you say, to become a global advocate for altruist philanthropy.
Which, it's worth mentioning that Gates, in his congressional testimony, stood up against regulation a lot more than Zuckerberg did. It's shocking in retrospect how much he did. Not that it got him anything, but in the end. But yeah, and Zuckerberg, of course, is also a Giving Pledge signer. Robert?
Yeah, I would say the only one treated worse than Gates is Michael Milken in the 1980s, who actually had to go to jail, trumped up charges, and paid $600 million in fines, and didn't defend himself, didn't know how to defend himself. While he was in jail, dozens of people sent him copies of Atlas Shrugged,
yes, knowing
that exactly what he's going through, and sadly, the novel didn't penetrate into him as well.
I should say, on returning to the previous theme, there are a lot of us here of similar views and similar views about the world influenced by Rand. And and Ben also is in the audience, speaking very strongly about these people as heroes. Go look for yourself. I mean, see, you might discover different when you look at them, or find them differently, or you might think about, this is the kind of case to look at if we're talking about on a global scale or on a political scale or on a societal scale of, are there people like this, not exactly like this, but like this in the essential attributes? What happens to them? What are the effects of their defending themselves or not defending themselves? What are the effects of the predominant morality on them when they try to practice it, when they're forced to practice it, when they're made to think and told that their achievements, while maybe useful in some way, aren't morally good? Don't take our word for it, as they used to say on Reading Rainbow. Go and look, and look at this testimony.
But here's
and see
an
what you think
observation that I recently made. Mm-hmm. In the Objectivist Academic Center, we were reading a book by Peter Singer, who's one of the world's current philosophical champions of the altruism that Gates has started to get on board about. Mm-hmm. Gates actually had an introductory essay in this little volume. It's his famous essay on famine and morality. One of the points that Singer makes in the introduction to this essay is, well, when I wrote this back in the 70s, there were lots of people starving, and India was about to starve to death. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the reason I thought it was so important that we all sacrifice ourselves to aid famine victims. Well, sometime since then, the threat of famine in India is somehow not as imminent. Mm-hmm. But I think my moral principles still apply. Why is it that the threat of famine in India is no longer as imminent? Well, one reason is because Norman Borlaug instituted the Green Revolution and created new forms of plants, agricultural crops that could grow in India that weren't able to before. But another reason is because Hyderabad and Bangalore have been transformed into Silicon Valleys of India, lifting entire generations of people out of poverty,
and if you
because of Bill Gates.
And if you think of
something.
What?
They thought of something.
Yes, they thought of something. Thanks, Will. As the planners expected, Reardon would. And also all the other revolutions that happened in all other fields of technology. How many of them are enabled by the fact that there's a computer on every desk in every home, which was the vision that Microsoft started with, right? Or running Microsoft software. It's impossible to calculate, or very difficult to calculate, how much of a difference these people have made in our lives. A handful of them, and not some of them were computer geniuses and software geniuses, but the ones who brought those innovations such that we all have them on our desks everywhere, that we're able to stream this out to the whole world, are the people like Gates, like Jobs to some extent, like Zuckerberg and Bezos and Brin and at Google, Brin and Page. These are the people who created that world. This is the world that we're living in. And these are people who are maybe sometimes looked at with a kind of awe, but are not looked at as moral, and not looked at as moral for doing these things. If Gates is looked at as moral now, it's for his altruism and his giving, not for what made him the money. And there's no amount of giving away billions of dollars that could possibly do as much for the world, including for the poorest people in the world, as running Microsoft did.
Should we look at what happens when that doesn't happen?
Yeah.
So we wanted to spend just a little bit of time still before we break on economics, and you thought it would be interesting to look at Atlas's depiction of what happens when the Gateses and the Zuckerbergs of the world depart, and its portrayal of economic collapse. And of course, the most telling detail in this book on that is the depiction of Starnesville, which is in my home state, Wisconsin. And how appropriate is it that then in the 70s and the 80s, you get, in effect, a multiplication of Starnesvilles through the Midwest in the Rust Belt, which is what they now call it. I mean, look at Detroit. And I think one common fallacy is that it's largely a result of foreign competition, Asian markets opening up, and more manufacturing jobs going there, and that's certainly part of it. But why are the jobs going there?
And why are these areas unable to reorganize around new lines? Why are the companies unable to find new ways to meet competitors? Why are the Asian manufacturers, when they want to now manufacture cars in America, not opening up plants in Detroit, where there were a lot of trained auto workers already, right? Some of them out of work, but are doing it in South Carolina and Georgia instead.
And I was thinking about this recently, and you can put your finger on at least two different factors that are, I think, not often appreciated. Was recently watching a documentary about the history of New York City, and the prevalence of manufacturing jobs in the city up until the 40s and the 50s. And it's really only after the 50s that the manufacturing sector starts to decline, and one of the reasons is because the federal government starts subsidizing industries indirectly through the rest of the country by means of the interstate highway system, and what happens is they kill the lake boats. That's why the Midwest exists. New York's major connection to the Midwest is the Erie Canal and the lakes, and they kill the lake boats. They subsidize.
Johnson subsidized the highway system.
They subsidized the
or
highway
Eisenhower, a lot of that was.
Eisenhower, and a whole lot of other subsidies for kind of suburban development more generally. But then, of course, you can't discount the role of labor laws and unionization, which turn a lot of these factories in the Midwest into little versions of the 20th Century Motor Company. And yeah, it's no surprise that people start to leave and go to the South and to the West and then to Asia.
And then if you look at the former Rust Belt cities that have rebounded, right, how did they rebound? So look at Pittsburgh, where I just was this morning. I flew in back from a conference there, and where I lived for a number of years in graduate school. Pittsburgh's one of the couple of Rust Belt cities that didn't fare as badly as some of the others and rebounded now got a very healthy economy, although it's smaller in size, fewer people than there used to be. But it's become a tech hub. Google has a satellite office there. Uber has their offices there. It's all the Silicon Valley companies who, doing branch offices on the semi-East Coast in Pittsburgh and Arizona, and so that the cities of these sort that are doing well because of this new economy in tech, which again doesn't. Because of the virtue of certain people, right? The other thing besides the Starnesville example that I think is instructive to think about the economic collapse in Atlas Shrugged is not a particular scene, but think about it playing out across the novel. We get a kind of sense of what it is for a country to disintegrate economically. What would the steps be by which a country would fall into this kind of chaos? And it's a kind of reverse story of how the countries were made, of how the country grew up, and the role of the railroads in it. And there are a lot of kind of extended episodes that show you this. The Little Fella's Day in the Sun is a particularly nice example, where the people who were excited that Wyatt was going to be gone, the smaller oil manufacturers who thought he was greedily, using up the whole market, start to see that without someone producing at the scale that Wyatt was able to produce, there was no market for drilling equipment, and you couldn't have a drilling industry made up of just, inept little fellas. But somebody who is of modest ability in oil is able to sustain a smaller oil company in a world where there's a Wyatt who's dominating it. And this is really a version of a point that we wanted to move on to, of the pyramid of ability point. We discussed a little bit in connection with Galt's speech the idea of a pyramid of ability, that the person who works for Hank Rearden is trading with Hank Rearden, and trades are always to mutual benefit. But when you have a trade between an especially able, gifted person, gifted not the right word, but brilliant person, who's producing value on a grand scale, and somebody who's competent but not at this person's level of ability, both benefit, but the person of more modest ability benefits disproportionately. And you get that point in the kind of more obvious way when you think of the, say, janitor sweeping up the factory, who's just doing this motion with the broom, maybe doing it well, but without somebody to make a factory, that motion wouldn't be very productive. And he doesn't know how to do something that would be productive at the scale of what he could earn at the factory, except in the context of a factory. Or think of someone like Eddie Willers, who's more able than that, but he knows how to be productive and how to do things that are valuable in the context of a railroad that somebody else creates for him. Doesn't have the kind of skill set to create a railroad or create another kind of business. But also we can see it between different businesses. There are a lot of kinds of business concerns that are able to be profitable in a world where they have larger competitors that create a kind of market and they're able to specialize. So other coffee shops in a world where there's Starbucks, accustoming people to have coffee shops all over the place and to have a culture where people hang out in coffee shops, and then other coffee shops can fill niches that Starbucks doesn't fill.
I've always thought that's a really good example of the little day in the sun point. I've also thought that this pyramid of ability discussion toward the end of Galt's speech is in many ways perfect, essentialized, all the way down to the fundamentals answer to Marxism. And you can see that if you compare Rand's view and her solution to the criticism that capitalism involves exploitation to the libertarian answer to that argument. I mean, that Marx's basic critique of capitalism is that it exploits the laborers. And so the standard kind of libertarian answer is something like, well, the laborers, they signed up for this job, it's voluntary, doesn't matter how bad the job gets, that they agreed to it, they're adults, and that's true, and it's important. And maybe a few of the same theorists will say, and the lot that they're getting in the factory is better than what they were getting on the farm. But there's a big difference between what they're saying and what Rand is saying, because she's not just saying, oh, it's voluntary. She's saying the laborers get a surplus from the capitalists that the capitalists don't get from them, the benefit of these new ideas, which the laborers have no way of paying back, save by permitting them freedom and the occasional thank you. And I mean, of course, it's the case that Marx is going to miss this dimension, because it's pointing to the spiritual realm. It's pointing to the intellectual benefit, which he thinks is just an after effect, which he thinks is just ideological superstructure. But I mean, if it's true that we have free will and that our minds are the ones that use it when we create new ideas, then that is the unmoved mover of prosperity, and the furthest thing from exploitation that you can imagine. And the libertarians miss this too, to the extent that they draw on only saying it's a voluntary interaction.
Or at least many of the libertarians.
And you see that same attitude in the iPencil discussion that we were having.
Yeah, I mean, we've been using the word libertarians, I should say, as though the term had some univocal meaning. But I don't think it does. I mean, it's a word that groups together a bunch of people. A lot of people use it to bunch us into, and not all the people who bunch themselves or get bunched into it think the same thing. So some of them, I think, would be more in agreement with this point and more receptive to it. Others not. I think none to the extent that Rand is, who really is the one who calls attention to this, but some, I think, have received this kind of idea better. So I don't want to be treating them all as though they're in the same boat. But I think it's Rand who really has called society's attention to this. And I think some of this business, insofar as you see people, businessmen themselves and then some other people, having a moral appreciation for the virtue involved in this kind of production and the role of the mind in it. And I think that is largely Rand's influence on the culture, whether directly or indirectly. Let's close with just a few words, Ben, on this last topic of why people think of the novel as only political or primarily political.
Why do people think of this novel as only political? I mean, it's to some extent you can answer this question easily, because there is an obvious and important conflict between the producers and the looter businessmen. But why do they miss all the other conflicts that relate to all of the deeper philosophic issues in the book? Why do they miss, for instance, and sometimes they get called out for this point, that they're missing the conflict between the producer, the productive businessman, and the looting businessman. Mm-hmm. But then they miss the conflict between Dagny and Galt. And they miss the conflict between that Dagny and Reardon have internally in their own souls.
I think it's for the same reason that a lot of people think the novel is repetitive.
Yeah.
And the reason is that they only understand the first third of it. So what you get in the first third of the novel, think of it as the first act of a play, right, is the setup for the real story, not the real story. You get something that could be a real story. That's an interesting real story about a heroic businesswoman with obstacles put in place by grifters and corrupt politicians and so forth, fighting to build this railroad, right, with this innovative new metal. And that's a good story. It's a good story of an achievement. But it's not the story of Atlas Shrugged. It's the thing that sets the stage for the main story of Atlas Shrugged, which begins with, this doesn't work. Why, even though she achieved this, did it not lead to the results it should have? Why did her greatest achievement undermine the things for the sake of which she did it? And if you're just focused on that story, and it's a compelling story, it's an exciting story, and you're admiring Dagny and you're thinking about that, you're not really seeing what happens afterwards. And what happens afterwards is a deeper and deeper reflections on why the first part went the way it did. Why did this not work? Why did the John Galt line have to be destroyed? What mistake was Dagny making? And so we go over, in a certain respect, the same ground over and over again. That same event and other events like it. But we're going over it again and again, each level going to a deeper level of understanding the motivation, of understanding what makes these characters act the way they do, of understanding what motivates Dagny. And that is a very sophisticated kind of reasoning process that it takes to follow the plot. And I think you can read the novel and find it exciting without fully doing that reasoning process. But then if you don't do it, you won't be able to identify what it was you found exciting about it. What you found exciting about it was Dagny. She was awesome, and Reardon, he was so great. And if you think about what was so exciting and great about them, it's most obviously portrayed in their building of the John Galt line. But you're not getting the full, you're not following the story. It's a complicated story that you need to think about these ideas to follow.
The Chris Farley show method of reading the story, if you remember.
Oh, that was awesome. I used that in my class all the time.
The old SNL sketch. You remember that one time when
Yeah.
Reardon told off the looters? That was awesome.
Yeah, I use that whenever I teach
Why is it?
teach Aristotle's Ethics, actually, the Chris Farley show. But you guys could ask me about what its role in Aristotle's Ethics is some of the time. All right, well, let's sign off for a little bit, and we'll come back at 6 or a little bit after 6, and we'll talk about the John Galt's moral philosophy and its role in the novel, which is what you see as doing the driving work and what it's about if you do this kind of digging and understanding what's going on in the later parts and how it's a reflection back on why the John Galt line wasn't a success in the end. Thanks, everybody.
A few minutes.